Hello, this is Martin Renault with Martin Renault Property Portraits. Just want to record a brief video today just to go through some of the tools that I use with my paintings. A lot of them are very basic, but some of them have some very fundamental qualities to them that are very important to my artwork. First, I'll go through some of the different pens and paint brushes and pencils that I like to use. One of my first stages in my painting is always drafting out what I'm going to do. And I like to use a really hard, light graphite. So I go with a 4H Prismacolor pencil. I've had a few of these that I use. They last a really long time because of the graphite being so hard. And it erases really easily and it doesn't show in the final product. So once I'm done with the pencil, the idea is to erase it completely and you don't have any pencil left in your painting. So it's an easy, really light graphite to use, and that's what I prefer with my paintings. I've tried some of the harder or some of the softer, darker graphite, and I find that it's messier, stays longer on the paintings, and it's harder to erase. My second most important tool that I use is my inking pens. So after I'm done with the pencil, I like to go over them with some permanent ink. They are watercolor proof. So when I do my painting after, there's no blending, there's no bleeding, there's no smudging. And once they're on there, it's permanent. And so that's the Pigma Micron pens. I have a variety of different sizes. My favorite though is the 005. So that's that one there. It's an archival ink, it's permanent, again no smudging, no bleeding, no blurring, and it's waterproof. That's the number one reason why I use it, is because it is waterproof, so that I can paint right over it and it not being an issue at all. After that, I do have a few different brushes that I use. I mainly stick to some smaller brushes for some of the finer detail work. I do prefer a flat edge brush or an angle edge, just so that I can get some of the details, some of the contouring, some of the lines in there really nicely. So I do like some of the flatter edge and some of the finer tipped brushes as well. So that's a round. This is Winsor & Newton, and some of these are fairly basic as well. They're Artist Loft, but they're good quality and they don't leave any hairs behind or anything like that. So it's an angular shader, and this one's Artist Loft. Again, it's a flat edge. For erasers, I basically just use a standard white eraser. It works really well just to get off the graphite. Again, it's very basic. A lot of the tools I use are fairly basic. Don't need anything too crazy for what I'm doing, but it's always good to experiment with some different tools as well. I do use metal ruler. It's really good to not have the corked bottom, cork board on the bottom, because I find that does smudge. When you have the ruler slide across the paper, it doesn't grip the paper, kind of slides over across the top, which again is important, and it's a fairly basic functioning ruler. It's nothing crazy, but again, it's very important. This is probably one of the most important tools that I use, really just to get the straight lines, accurate measurement. I find that I use it so much that some of the graduated lines do end up wearing off in time, so I'll need to get a new one every once in a while, which is unfortunate, but it's not the worst as well. Some of the paints that I use a variety of different paints, and I found there's a few colors in particular that I like from a few brands. Number one that I found that I hated at first, but I found that I really like it for a few particular reasons. Shingles, some shading, things like that. It's actually Payne's Gray by Reeves. It's kind of unique because it's a bluish gray, but it's not too black, it's not too blue, so it can end up being used for a variety of different things. But at first I didn't like it, but as I used it more, I found that it was quite useful. Other than that, I bought some Winsor & Newton, Marie's, and most of the small paint tubes that I go through, white, black, and blue, are really my most common, and I get those again from Winsor & Newton. Cotman watercolors. I find they're all fairly good. There's not too much grittiness with anything that I've looked at, I've used. I haven't really had a problem with anything, and I haven't been blown away by any specific watercolor paint that I've used. I find oils and acrylic have a lot more varying degree of quality with some of the prices that I've used, but the watercolors have all been fairly impressive. I haven't found anything difficult or problematic with them. As they age, sometimes they can get either oily or gritty when you try to use them. For my palette, I do end up using just a plain tinfoil over plate. Again, it's very basic, but what it does do for me is it allows me to use what I want, simply change it out. It's very simple, and I get to see the colors, and I don't really notice too much different with any other palettes that I've tried to use. I have used plain palettes, but I find this works for me, and so if you find something that works for you, stick by it. Always feel free to experiment, but for me, I found a few things that really work for me. Plain water cup. There's really not too much to say there. I've had it for a long time. It's kind of been my cup that I use. It's for the water. You put the watercolor paint with the water. Obviously, that's how that works. The other thing is toilet paper. I know it may sound silly, but it is a technique that I use very often, is to blot the paint. And I've tried Kleenex, I've tried some other things as well, paper towel, but none of them really work too well. Where just plain toilet paper does pick up the paint, and I find it doesn't leave any residue, which you might find. And I use quite a bit of that, and I'll probably show that technique more in some of my other videos, where if you go slightly too far with a color, you want to clean it up. It's one of the easiest things that I've learned, just to soak up the paint a little bit. Mistakes happen, and with watercolor painting, as you might know, that it is very difficult often to go back on what you've done, modify it, edit it. But I've learned a number of tricks down the road to mitigate some of that, and some techniques that I will show in later videos, so that as you are working with your watercolor, permanent ink, things like that seem like there's no going back, that you will actually have an option to modify it, edit it as you work on it. So it's kind of a misconception that watercolor, once it's on there, there's nothing you can do. But for minor errors, there are some tricks that you can do. And that's why I do use a thicker 140-pound watercolor paper. Cold press I find is nice. It does have a nice texture to it. Usually there's two sides to the paper. One's a little bit more coarse and one's more flat. You can use either side. I haven't found that there's been a problem using either side of the paper. I do switch it up sometimes, but I do prefer the flatter side just for what I do. I find the textured side sometimes does get in the way of some of the painting. I like to be very precise and not kind of have that textured look to my paintings. But I find since it's 140-pound paper, it's pressed really well, it's quality, and it lets you do some of those techniques with the paper. There's not too much bending, wrinkling. I don't find there's too much paper that gets pulled up over time as well with the painting. Sometimes that can happen since you're dealing with water and paper, that it will start to pull up. But that's if you're really working the paper over and over, it can start to do that. But if you're impatient, if you apply layer after layer, it shouldn't. But if you really try to work with the paper and the brush, it can start to pull up if you're too quick with it. That has happened sometimes. It can be a bit of a problem to work around, but usually there is, again, another way to fix that. So this one's a Strathmore watercolor paper. I've used this in the medium size as well as a smaller size. I do like it. It is good paper. For my bigger paintings, I do use a Canson. That's a Canson Extra Large Series cold press. Again, 140 pound. I do like the paper because, again, it's very thick, workable. I don't like working with watercolor paper that will have a watermark in it. If it's been stamped with the name of the paper, sometimes you can't use the whole paper, or you'll have to cut out the piece that you want if you don't want that watermark in it, or if it's in the other side of the paper. So it can be a bit of a hassle sometimes. I like this. It's very simple, very easy to use, very straightforward. And I do cut my paper out to size at the size that I want. So I'll go through that again in another video, how I set up my paper, how I start with the drafting. Most of my techniques though are really with the watercoloring, the watercolor paint. But the most important parts are actually going through and drafting my houses out. I've done a variety of different paintings, from landscapes to architectural paintings. My main focus is architectural houses. That's mainly what I do. But there's a number of different reasons to use the techniques that I do with pencil drafting, either not putting any ink on, but at least having that draft out so you know exactly where you're going to go with your paint, having a bit of a strategy behind it. If you're looking to be more technical, on the other hand, you can go completely freestyle and really not have too much direction with your painting and just go through how it feels. But I find I get a much better turnout, much more accurate if I have drafted everything out, usually changing things a number of times over the way before I make it permanent with my permanent ink. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to. Even send me an email or a comment, and I'm more than happy to go through it with you. But again, just wanted to record a brief video to show some of the tools that I do use. The only other tool that I might use would be, I have a compass, some circular rulers to get some shapes out, and I do use, if I do need to pull up some of the paper, which again is another technique, I can use the edge of a sharp knife to pull up some of the pigmented ink, but you have to be very careful not to make it too noticeable. You don't want to rip up too much paper. But again, that's why if you use a really thick paper, it kind of gives you some of those options that you might not otherwise have. So I did want to say again, most of my tools are very basic. They're not crazy advanced or expensive, but there's a very good reason why I use what I use and how I use it, and that works for me. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for watching my video. More than happy to answer any questions, and I'll have many more videos to come. Thank you.